Sometimes I admit I run into situations where I'm just not really sure where to put a locomotive on any of the lists so far. Like, they're obscure and I want to talk about them, but they're not really mad science experiments, they weren't really bad, they weren't really amazing either, and I can't even call them average, because average kind of implies that they were fairly prevalent, but these locomotives weren't at all. So I'm like, where do I put them? And then I just decided, well, why not just make a list of just really obscure locomotives? Locomotives that you probably haven't heard of. Just, they existed, but they either existed in only one country and in very, very few numbers, or even for only one company and in very, very few numbers. So here's 5 locomotives that are just really obscure. The FS 670 locomotives. Anyone outside of Italy probably has no idea what this thing is, and that's okay. Though they were, in fairness, out of every locomotive I've decided to put on this list, the most prevalent, as 43 of them were actually produced, and they weren't originally designated the 670s. They were, at first, the RA 500s, but they were steam locomotives constructed in the year 1900. These were actually cab forwards, hence the bizarre, rather spacious, cab. And indeed, they were rather cutting edge in that regard, as unless it's an oil burner, it's usually pretty obnoxious to give a steam locomotive setup a cab forward design, but the Italians did manage to pull it off. They were double expansion, saturated steam engines with 4 cylinders, 2 internal and 2 external. And she had one of the most peculiar looking tenders I've ever seen. It was basically a tank car with a little box on it for someone to be in. But in case you think it was a tank car because it was using oil, no. The tank was for water. The 670s burned coal, which was placed in bunkers on both sides of the boiler. They were bizarre, but admittedly they did function fairly well. But the line was cancelled, and no more examples in this particular setup were built. The reasoning for this seems to be a combination of a few factors. For one thing, the fireman had to work backward, and as such, he couldn't really have that much input when it came to monitoring the route the locomotive was on with the engineer. On top of that, the coal bins being placed on either side actually created mutual obstacles for both crew members, and the driver, since he was always looking out the front, couldn't actually detect signs of any technical problems, like bizarre noises or smells, from the locomotive's workings. Sources aren't clear exactly when they would have been withdrawn, but all of them seem to have been scrapped. The Canadian high-pressure steam locomotive. Interesting. This locomotive was built for Canadian Pacific, and it was numbered 8000. It was a 3-cylinder compound high-pressure experimental locomotive, built using the Schmidt high-pressure system, which utilized a closed circuit of steam and distilled water that worked at 1,350 psi, which transferred heat to a high-pressure boiler that was working at 850 psi to supply the center cylinder. The exhaust steam from that was then mixed with 250 psi pressure steam from the low-pressure boiler to feed the 2 outside cylinders. It was bizarre, though it worked pretty well, except that it was very, very, very high in maintenance costs. The locomotive herself was built by Angus Shops, and she was Canadian Pacific's heaviest steam locomotive. They operated her on the Mountain Subdivision between 1931 and 1936, but she was scrapped by 1940. The reason seems to be down to the Schmidt high-pressure system. Simply put, it was too expensive. Maintenance on it was a nightmare. So any savings they might have seen from the high-pressure steam was negated because of the way the system worked. Another fun fact about it is that it was a 210-4, technically making it a Texas type. But Canadian Pacific did not use the term Texas for that wheel arrangement. They called them Selkirks. Either way though, she seems to have been a pretty impressive beast, just not efficient enough to be worth it, and the design was never repeated. 400 class. These were a pair of electric locomotives built in 1926 for Paris-Orleans. Their serial numbers were E401 and E402, and though they operated in France, they were actually constructed by Garretts works in Hungary. These locomotives were designed by Kalman Kando, and the arrangement was very unusual for DC locomotives. But Kando was known to have designed AC locomotives, with large diameter frame-mounted AC motors, so it's believed that his work on them influenced his work on these DC locomotives. Their four motors were mounted rigidly on the frames, above the driving wheels, and each motor then drove an external jack shaft crank, with the four driving axles each coupled in pairs. They were meant to be express passenger locomotives, and indeed they were capable of fairly high speeds, technically. About 75 miles per hour, 120 kilometers per hour. And they were rather powerful, but they weren't very reliable. They had a habit of breaking down pretty frequently when actually driven at higher speeds. So when other passenger locomotives became available, they restricted them to freight work at no more than 50 miles per hour, 80 kilometers per hour. But they could do that pretty well still, as they did deliver 4,800 horsepower. And though maintenance staff probably hated their guts, crews actually liked them a lot. They were very easy to work with when it came to actual operation, and they were known to be pretty smooth riders. And they survived just barely into the advent of the national state-owned railway company in France, SNCF, until 1938, but were withdrawn and both scrapped that same year. Arnold's Electro-Pneumatic locomotive. What? Is that a doodlebug? A trolley? What the heck is Electro-Pneumatic? I almost put this on a mad science experiment list, but to be honest, there's very little we actually know about this ridiculous thing, on the basis that it never really was able to be tested properly. This railcar was supposed to use the compression and expansion of air to implement a form of regenerative braking, as well as also control the synchronous electric motors that were fitted to it. When the car was going downhill, air was compressed and stored in tanks underneath it. When required, that stored air was released back into the compressor cylinders, which then acted as a motor to assist the electric drive. This design seems to be the brainchild of Bjorn J. Arnold, who actually had a very impressive record as a rail engineer. He is sometimes called the father of the third rail, so when it came to electric rail cars, he was the guy. And the idea, though bizarre, seems like it might have worked decently. But sadly, Arnold would never actually get a chance to really test the thing, because literally the day after it was finished, it was destroyed by a fire along with two other rail cars. In retrospect, there are some flaws, as the system did have a lot of moving parts, and there are some areas of it where it might have had some inefficiencies, but it still would have been interesting to see properly tested, but fate had different ideas. Garretts number 1 and 2 of the Fyansford Cement Works Railway. Ooh, I get to talk about Garretts again. Garretts are an interesting design that looks very, 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 very perplexing to people from the United States and Canada, but not really that weird for everybody else, as they were a fairly prevalent design, all things considered. They had some advantages, and saw significant use all over the world, just not here. Interestingly, Alco actually had a contract to be able to build Garretts, but whenever they tried to drum up interest in this design, American Railways took one look at this foreign concept and said, basically, "Savages, savages, barely even human! Savages, savages, drive them from our shore!" So we never had any Garretts here for the most part, but Australia definitely did, as did the Fyansford Cement Works Railway, which was an industrial railway near Geelong, Australia, that was built by the Australian Portland Cement Company to carry limestone from their quarry to their cement works. And on the railway, they had, well, actually 3 Garretts. One was number 3, which is still in preservation as the last remaining complete Australian standard Garretts. But there were two others that were there before number 3. Number 1 and number 2. These weren't Australian standards. These were a different design that never actually had a class. They were two 60 plus 062s, and they were constructed by Bayer Peacock and Company in 1938. Their design was very similar to WGR's M-Class Garretts, but it wasn't quite the same, and again, they weren't actually given a class. They just ran and had their numbers. When the Cement Works Railway closed down in 1966, most of its rolling stock was donated for preservation, but a few things were scrapped, and one of them turned out to be number 1. But her sister, number 2, was able to be saved, and was actually on display at the Puffing Billy Railways Museum at Menzies Creek, and that was until fairly recently, 2010. Then she was relocated to the Bellarine Railway, and they plan to eventually restore her, which, that would be great actually. It's nice to see one of the most obscure locomotives I've ever seen in my life, not even having a class that can be attributed to it, possibly get a second chance. So hopefully someday the world can see number 2 in operation again, which is the best way she can proudly honor her lost sister. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Cross's Row of Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Lord Odd 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Iserfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alaric Jaspers, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, Dr. Racer 78, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Prez Strenton, and Bradley Bowden. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.